Chapter 6 Processed Food. Do you eat a lot of corn? Looking at it one way, each American eats only about a bushel of corn per year, but that number only includes the corn that looks like corn, corn on the cob, or corn out of a can, or corn chips. But if you count all the corn we eat directly and indirectly, the average American eats a ton of corn every year. We don't recognize it as corn though, because it's been turned into something else. Almost half of it is eaten by animals and turned into beef, chicken, fish, or pork. 1/10 of the U.S. corn crop is turned into processed food. To make processed food, corn is first broken down into different parts. Those parts are put back together in new ways, to make the sweetener in your soft drink or the starch in your hamburger roll. All of this happens in a factory called a wet mill. The old sort of mill, which simply grinds grain into flour or meal, is a dry mill. To follow the industrial food chain, I had to follow the river of corn through a wet mill. There are 25 major wet mills in the United States, most of them owned by two corporations, Cargill and Archer Daniels Midland. George Naylor's corn probably went to Cargill's mill in Iowa City. ADM runs a giant plant in Decatur, Illinois. Both of those companies refused to let me tour their plants. Luckily, I was allowed to visit a smaller mill at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. Iowa State really should be called the University of Corn. Corn is the hero of many of the sculptures and murals on campus. The soybean, Iowa's second largest crop, gets its share of attention too. The school's wet mill is part of something called the Center for Crop Utilization Research. Larry Johnson, the center's director, was more than happy to show me around. Johnson described the wet mill as kind of an industrial digestive system. The mill itself is a maze of stainless steel pipes, valves, filters, and tanks. Corn travels through the maze and is broken down through a series of steps including grinding, like the teeth, and soaking in acid, like the stomach. By the time it reaches the end, the corn is reduced to simple molecules, mostly sugar. Soybean goes through a similar process. The first step in the digestion of corn is to split the kernel into its different parts. The yellow skin, the germ, the tiny part nearest the cob, that's the part that holds the tiny embryo of a corn plant, and the endosperm, the biggest part of the kernel filled with carbohydrates. When a shipment of corn arrives at the mill, it is soaked for 36 hours in a slightly acid bath. This swells the kernels and loosens the skin. After the soak, the swollen kernels are ground in a mill. By now, the germ is rubbery and it pops right off. Johnson explained, the germ is then squeezed for corn oil. Corn oil can be used as a cooking or salad oil. Some of it is hydrogenated. That means hydrogen is forced into the oil molecules. This makes the oil stay solid at room temperature, and so it can be used for margarine. Doctors used to think margarine was healthier for you than butter and would not cause heart disease. Now, researchers think that these hydrogenated trans fats in margarine are actually worse for our hearts than butter. Trans fats are also used in processed snacks, baked goods, and many other processed foods. Once the germ has been removed for oil, the kernels are crushed. That makes a white mush of protein and starch called mill starch. The mill starch can be used in animal feed. What's left after that is a white liquid that's poured out onto a stainless steel table. It dries to a fine superwhite powder, cornstarch. Cornstarch is wet milling's first product back in 1840s. At first, the starch was mainly used for laundry, to make shirts stiff. Then, cooks and food companies began adding cornstarch to as many recipes as they could. The starch was cheap and had a nice white color that people thought was pure. By 1866, the mill owners had learned how to break down cornstarch into a kind of sugar called glucose. The glucose, corn syrup, wasn't as sweet as sugar, but it was cheap. Ever since, corn sweeteners have been the industry's most important product. The big breakthrough came in the 1960s. That's when Japanese chemists discovered an enzyme that could be transform glucose into the much sweeter sugar molecule called fructose. high fructose corn syrup was born. It's a blend of 55% fructose and 45% glucose that tastes exactly as sweet as table sugar. Today, it is the most valuable food product refined from corn. High fructose corn syrup, or HFCS, is by far the biggest food output of the country's wet mills, but there are hundreds of other food ingredients created from the remaining cornstarch. Some is made into other sugars like maltodextrin, which can be used to make instant pudding or gravy. Some is fermented to become ethanol. Some of it is fermented starch is used to make plastic. At the end, there's almost nothing left. Even the dirty water from the process is used to make animal feed. The wet mill is like a giant steel beast with a maze of pipes and machines inside. At one end, it eats millions of bushels of corn feed to every day by the trainload. At the other end of the beast are hundreds of spigots, large and small. Out of each spigot flows a different product made from corn, called fractions by the food industry. Many of these fractions, the sugar and starches, the alcohols and acids, the emulsifiers and stabilizers with the strange names, will be made into food. They are put together to make cereal or snack food or chicken nuggets or TV dinners or just about anything else you can imagine and ingest. In fact, you would be hard pressed to find a processed food today that isn't made from corn or soybeans.